So I imagine a lot of you guys have read stories in the paper about millennials and how many millennials live with their parents. You have people who are in their 20s, oftentimes are only imperfectly engaged with the labor force, and they're living at home and they're relying on private transfers, meaning the bank of mom and dad, in order to ensure that they're living a decent life. But imagine the difference between someone who is living at home in mom and dad's basement, and that basement is, let's say, the 20th floor of an apartment building on the Upper East Side, versus living in mom and dad's basement. If mom and dad are struggling people who have very limited resources, and you're living in a community where you have to share this tiny apartment with a number of other relatives, a number of other people who really need your resources. It's the same phenomenon. It's a young person who is coming home and to rely on parental resources. But in one case, you have a family that is richly endowed with resources, both literal and figurative. By literal, I mean it could be money. It could mean I own property. By figurative, I mean, well, you may well be embedded in a kind of social network that gives you access to more opportunities. I'm going to throw out some buzzwords to you guys. I'm a big believer that two of the chief problems this country faces, and two of the chief problems this country has faced for decades, are ethno-racial inequality and multi-generational poverty. So ethno-racial inequality, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is a society in which people at the top of society look very different from people at the bottom of society in a way that is very durable and creates this very lasting pattern that creates negative stereotypes and much else that can become really toxic. Then when we're looking at multi-generational poverty, what do I mean by that? Well, when you look at poverty, some of it is intermittent, meaning that, I might have had, let's say I had an accident, so I can't do my job that requires a lot of physical dexterity. So I temporarily am poor, but then I go back to the class status that I had before, I go back to making a living, versus chronic poverty, meaning that I'm constantly falling below the poverty line, no matter how hard I try, because I have limited resources, because I have a limited social network, an impaired social network, it's extremely hard for me to kind of climb that ladder. So multi-generational poverty is when you have chronic poverty in one generation, and then you have children who are suffering from chronic poverty as well, and that pattern recurs and recurs and recurs. So again, ethno-racial inequality and multi-generational poverty. And the problem is in the United States, these two problems tend to coexist. They tend to overlap. A lot of folks who are part of the multi-generational poor are also people who are part of underrepresented groups. They're part of groups that have been stigmatized and disadvantaged. In my opinion...
Reihan, I think we lost sound.
Okay.
Just hold on for 1 second.
Just use the other mic for a second.
Get him that one.
When we think about, when we think about immigration policy, I tend to think that we should think about it as secondary to the challenges of multi-generational poverty and ethno-racial inequality. Is our immigration policy making it easier to tackle these challenges, or is it making it harder to tackle these challenges? The reason I believe this to be the case is that, okay, imagine a society 20 years from now in which pretty much everyone who is upper middle income or rich is of Asian descent or of non-Hispanic white descent. And if you have a working class and a non-working poor class of society that is disproportionately people of color, non-Asian, disproportionately Hispanic, okay? Would that society be seen as a fair or just society? Is that going to be a society that has legitimacy in the eyes of people who are at the bottom of that society? My sense is that the answer is no. So how do you prevent that outcome from coming to pass? My sense is that what you need to do is be sure that the institutions that are devoted to facilitating upward mobility are working. They're working well for everybody. And I think that if you're looking at our country right now, I think it's safe to say that these institutions are not working well for everybody, particularly if you're in the bottom 2/5 of society. So when Steve is talking about public schools, and he's talking about public schools which have a high concentration of folks who are from immigrant households who are very poor, we're talking about a situation in which you are expecting children to make an enormous leap from one generation to the next. Okay, so basically, there are two ways of talking about mobility. There's absolute mobility and relative mobility. Absolute mobility means I make more money than my parents in literal cash terms. Relative mobility means that my class status improves over time. If I come from Bangladesh to the United States, my absolute mobility is extraordinary in the first generation. I'm earning far, far more than I did before. But if I'm the child of someone who is a Bangladeshi immigrant, who is extraordinarily poor, who is living in a neighborhood with a high poverty concentration. And also, I have limited social networks. My social network consists largely of other poor immigrants who are occupying this other kind of low-end niche of the economy, other people who are primarily working with their brawn rather than their skills and what have you. Then I have limited resources that I can pass on to my child. What my child needs is for the school system, the public schools, and for other public institutions to help close that extraordinary gap between that kid and other kids who are in the middle class or in the upper middle class. On top of that, we have this intense stratification in which you have upper middle income parents who are devoting more and more time to their children's education, a model people call high investment parenting. Okay, most immigrants, as Steve mentioned, are very heavily concentrated in a small number of districts and cities and what have you. Really, they're concentrated in about 6 metropolitan areas in the United States. Now, most of these metropolitan areas are places where even getting on the housing ladder is extremely difficult. If you're in the San Francisco Bay Area, if you're in New York City, if you want to own a home, oftentimes you're not just relying on your own income, sometimes you're relying, if you're someone who's in your 40s, you might be relying on parental resources, right? I mean, so these intense intergenerational inequalities get compounded over time. Okay, so now let's think back to that second generation, these kids who are in public school right now. If what it takes to get on the housing ladder is not only to have parents who have resources, including social capital and cultural capital, it's having grandparents who have those resources. It's a really extraordinary thing. What we're asking people to do is make this enormous social leap from being at the bottom of an hourglass economy to being at the top of an hourglass economy, because as Steve was suggesting earlier, those middle rungs of society are just not really there in the same way they had been before. So again, this is fine if you think that no one cares about ethno-racial inequality. No big deal. Who cares if everyone at the bottom of society looks one way and everyone at the top of society looks another way? If you believe that that's not going to cause enormous social tension in our society, then fine. We don't really have to worry about it. It's great. Hey, the first generation made this huge leap in absolute terms. Just because their children aren't making the same leap, no big deal. Who cares? But I would suggest that if we're looking at modern America, we see an enormous amount, again, of tension and kind of doubts about the legitimacy of our society when you don't have that representativeness. And I think that there are good reasons to worry about that too. So when we're thinking about this, again, folks who are coming from low-income immigrant households really depend on the public sector to work. So what are the conditions that allow the public sector to work well? One thing that we hear a lot about now, for example, is the idea of early childhood education, early childhood intervention. I have news for you guys. If you are going to have extremely intensive early childhood interventions for folks from low-income households, it's not free. Not only is it not free, but actually the teachers, the people who provide that instruction, there's this growing pressure to ensure that those are people who have adequate training and preparation. People with adequate training and preparation in our society, they do not work for a smile and a candy cane. They work for a wage. They expect to be paid well for the kind of education and training that they have, okay? So what this means is that we're going to have to apply far more resources. When we talk about the immigration debate, we often talk about the net fiscal impact. Are people going to be paying more in taxes than they receive in benefits? Well, what we're saying is if we take multi-generational poverty and ethno-racial inequality seriously, we are going to have to redistribute more. We are going to have to devote more resources to poor folks who come from families that have limited social networks and have very low parental resources. So what that means is that if we have a net fiscal cost now associated with large amounts of low-skilled immigration, that means that cost is going to have to go up by necessity if we want to avoid this disaster of having a society in which ethno-racial inequality is more intense rather than less intense in the future. So basically, if we had zero immigration from now on, if we just magically were able to kind of cut it off entirely, we would have the landscape that Steve describes in his report. You have a landscape in which, in the state of California, about 48% of kids are coming from immigrant households, and a large majority are from low-income households, meaning below 200% of the federal poverty level. These are people where, if you deny them Medicaid, it's not like, oh, cool, okay, I guess I don't need health care anymore. That's awesome. That totally worked out. No. They need those services. It's going to be a situation in which you are a parent who is in poverty and you have to work. your child is not going to have supervision. And if you don't have early childhood education, if you don't have after school programs and other resources for that kid, it's not like, oh, that's all going to work out just perfectly. And that kid from that background is going to become a software engineer, is going to be working in some other high-end profession. That might happen every now and again, and we as a society fetishize those examples of the tiny handful of people who overcome those odds. But the truth is that on average, if you come from that kind of background, you're going to struggle. So then again, if you believe that ethno-racial inequality and multi-generational poverty are important problems, and again, there's legitimate disagreement about that, maybe you don't think so, but if you believe that they're important problems, to me it makes sense to see immigration policy as secondary to that. We want to have successful integration and upward mobility for people from the bottom. And that's going to mean thinking very hard. So in the medium term, again, even in a world in which we have zero immigration from now on, that might have to mean devoting more resources to the schools that Steve is talking about. That might mean devoting more resources in terms of English language instruction and other ways that you're trying to close the deficits between very poor parents and more affluent parents. This is something that people don't want to face up to because they see immigrants purely as a workforce. Gosh, what's going to happen? Kind of who is going to be the janitorial staff? Who's going to do X, Y, Z? Well, that is a very narrow perspective because it forgets that the thing is that people who are workers today have children who are going to become workers of the future. And they might not be able to become workers who are going to be able to leap into the top half of the hourglass.